Hello and welcome to the Arc Woman podcast. This is an exploration of womankind. Here we discuss what it is to be a woman in the modern world while utilizing ancient and modern modalities in tandem to create a bounty of health for the body, mind and spirit. G'day girls and welcome back to the pod. Before we get into it, I just wanted to apologize. My audio isn't very good. I was dealing with a Tasmanian storm, my software crashed that day, and my microphone dropped out, and I wasn't willing to give up. The most important thing is that Tara's audio is incredible, and she does most of the talking on this podcast, as a guest should, and she drops some amazing information about the thyroid. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up about that. I've tried to clean up my audio as best as I can, but you can only do so much. So let's get into this amazing podcast and listen to Tara.
Welcome. Thanks for being here and thanks for making the time for this today. Really appreciate it. And I'm actually really excited about this. I've been wanting to talk about thyroid with someone for a really long time, and I was scouring, and it was actually one of your old clients who reached out to me and said, hey, have you heard about Tara's work? And I was like, oh my goodness, thank you. Finally, someone who feels confident about talking about this. And I love how you've had a personal journey with your thyroid as well. Start off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came into studying naturopathy and being interested in naturopathy first off?
Yeah, sure. So I think it started I was just from 15, really. 14, 15. I remember starting in aerobics class with one of my mum's friends. She walked into a house. I think we're talking the 80s back here. In the 11 Newton-John. Even had the head warmer and all the little headbands. So I started going to aerobics with her. So I got into sort of exercise at a young age and just, came up from a pretty healthy upbringing pretty much. And then I actually left school and I studied teaching in Perth for a year and decided I really did not want to be a teacher, and went off on a bit of a self-discovery journey and did a bit of traveling, had a few interesting relationships. And it was actually on the way back from the Eastern States in an airport that I picked up a wellbeing magazine, and I saw that I was a bit lost looking for a new direction. I think I was about 23. And I saw on the back of a wellbeing magazine, study naturopathy. So I got back home to mum and dad, and they were living up north of WA at the time. And we looked into and found Perth Academy Natural Therapies in Perth. And we drove back down and we registered, and I started the next year, and 4-year degree, and never looked back. Absolutely loved every moment of it.
So what led you to focus so intensely on thyroid conditions in particular? Does that interest your personal journey with the thyroid? Or were you interested in it previously and then you had your personal journey with that? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so I was kind of 20 years into it. I'd already run a multidisciplinary practice that I for about 5.5 years, which I sold when I was pregnant with my first child, and then had 2 more quite quickly. And then going back into it probably about 4 years later, things had definitely changed. And I was working from home then, and just sort of, one-to-one patients in clinic. And it was probably about 20 years of being a naturopath. Things were starting to change in the industry. People were running workshops, and I was just sort of thinking, well, maybe I do something a little bit different. And I don't know, I started to see the universe, I think, gives you what exactly you put out for. I started to see really complex thyroid conditions coming into my clinic, whereas I couldn't tell you, even when I had my practice, that I saw a lot of thyroid. It was not on my radar. I think we just brushed over a lot in when we're learning about it. I can't even remember learning anything about the thyroid in my studies, maybe a few thyroid herbs. So I started to get these really kind of intense presentations, like a Graves patient, with really bad ophthalmologic symptoms, and very, very, high antibodies and high thyroid hormones. I learned a lot in that case, really good, which I talk about a lot in my practitioner training. But so I got lots of presentations, and then one day I was at the GP and I'm like, let's test my thyroid. I'm getting all of my practitioners and my patients were testing thyroid now, let's do it. And lo and behold, my GP texted me and said, oh, you got a TSH of 7 point something and your thyroid hormones are really low. You've got hypothyroidism. And I just about fell off my chair. So, of course, then we got my antibodies tested and I had Hashimoto's. And, of course, then I tested all my family, and my youngest of 3 had Hashimoto's as well. And it just explained so much. So many things started to become clear. At this stage, I was already well into niching into thyroid I'd already developed my first practitioner training courses in thyroid. So I was living, eating, breathing, and I still did not even pick up my own thyroid condition. Probably one of the first signs of that was when I think about 7 or 8 months postpartum with my third child, and I'd had 3 consecutive pregnancies very fast, 3 cesarean sections because I just could not birth my children. My hair snapped off, like literally above here. It just all snapped off, which was really devastating. And yes, I was always tired and exhausted, but hey, I had 3 children and I was running a practice and I was doing all of the things. And when I got over my feelings of, oh, I'm a fraud, and I didn't even pick up my own thyroid condition, or my youngest child, who definitely struggled a lot throughout her teenage years, I thought, right, well, if I'm walking around not knowing I've got a thyroid condition, how many other women similar to me are walking around with a thyroid condition and they don't even know it? So that really fueled me to dive deeper into research, dive deeper into awareness, and really start to specialize and get it out there, and and really get people testing and looking at thyroid health. A bit of an evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like you were given that little peek into the thyroid and how insidious it is and how you can't really see it. And the moment you know the signs, you see it in everyone. And it is something that you see over and over and over again. And more often than not, we see it a lot more in women, I would say, as well. And it is something we joke about a lot. Oh, I've had 3 kids, my hair's falling out, ha, ha, ha. It's like, no, this is serious. We need to actually look into this. Your thyroid is so integral. Yeah. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of talking about all of those, fancy clinical terms, talking about Tri-B and all the other antibodies, I want to just talk about what is the thyroid gland, because I think a lot of people listening to this are not in the know of what it is. So what is the thyroid gland? Where is it? Why is it so central to health? Do you mind giving us a little bit of a breakdown about this amazing endocrine gland?
It is an amazing endocrine gland. I have such awe for it. It is a tiny little butterfly-shaped gland that sits in the center of our neck, below sort of the Adam's apple, and it is quite small. And it is shaped. It has a sort of bit in the middle, so to speak, called an isthmus, and it has 2 wings that sort of join onto that. So it does actually look like a little butterfly. And it produces thyroid hormones, T4 and T3, predominantly T4, a little bit of T3. And we can dive into those hormones in a minute. And basically every cell in the body, doesn't matter if it's a heart cell, a skin cell, a brain cell, a hair cell, a gut cell, every cell in the body requires active T3 hormone to activate its metabolic rate. So cells cannot function without thyroid hormones. So whatever that cell is doing, whatever the metabolism that cell is doing. So if you can think brain, it's pretty important for our brains to think. The brain is very sensitive to thyroid hormones, and the heart is very sensitive to thyroid hormones as well. So that heart can't function without adequate T3. And I'll talk a lot about T3 because that is the active thyroid hormone, but that a lot of people look at TSH and they look at a lot of T4, but T3 is the one that it's essential that I'm looking at and making sure that that's in optimal levels. So things like, metabolism, metabolic rate, protein, digestion, bone health in specifically. So heart, cardiovascular function, kidney function, liver function. So it's pretty much one of those all-rounders. And I kind of look at it as it's this little gland that sits sort of fairly at the top of the body, and it's very homeostatic. So anything happening upstream or downstream, it's really trying to go, okay, there's a problem over here. We need to pump out more thyroid hormones. Or, okay, there's a little bit too much going on here. Let's slow that down. So it is a very homeostatic little gland that will try and bring balance to wherever issues are happening in the body. And it can be affected by so many things. So it's important, but it's like super sensitive.
Super sensitive. It's almost the sacred balancer in the body. I always sort of that if something's out of thyroid, it's almost always going to be the first one to try and pull it out and pull it back into homeostasis, often at the detriment to itself, whether it goes overactive or underactive, and we'll get into that when we swing between them. But I just want to talk about the molecules themselves, so T3 and T4 and what they stand for. So T4 is 4 iodine molecules, T3 is 3. Do you mind telling us why it's important that we focus on T3? T4 is really important as well. And perhaps starting that conversation around like thyroid binding globulin and how we can regulate at the cell membrane as well.
Yeah, so let's just maybe start with a little bit of physiology. So in response to say low thyroid hormones in the body, say if there's low thyroid hormones going on, the digestion a bit slow, there's a little bit of stress going on, it all starts in the brain, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will release something called TRH, or thyrotrophin releasing hormone. And that actually sends a signal down to the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, to say, okay, there's more thyroid hormones needed in the body. Let's release TSH. So TSH, our thyroid stimulating hormone, that when you go to the doctor, they usually just focus on TSH. TSH comes from the pituitary. It's a signaling molecule. It doesn't actually have a physiological effect in the body. It's a signaling molecule to the thyroid to tell the thyroid how much or how little thyroid hormones to release. So in response to low thyroid hormones in the body, TSH will stimulate the gland to release preformed thyroid hormones out into the bloodstream, which go to target organs, hopefully does its job, fixes the thyroid hormone levels, and then the message will go back to the hypothalamus and then back to the pituitary to say, yep, we're all good, let's just level out. So the thyroid gland produces our T4, so thyroxine or T4, yes, which contains 4 molecules of iodine. It also needs tyrosine, also needs selenium, zinc, to get a good protein to be manufactured. So the thyroid gland produces around 90% thyroxine and only about 10% T3, which is your active hormone. So most of the gland is making and storing T4, which is our pro hormone, okay? Now, T4, as well as TSH, is inactive. It does not have a physiological role in the body. So that T4, once it's released out into the bloodstream, gets converted to the active thyroid hormone T3. In places 60% happens in the liver, so we need to have a healthy liver. 20% happens in the gut, so gut function can deter that conversion. 20% in the peripheral tissue, so anything like inflammation, poor circulation can affect that conversion as well. And then another 20% gets converted to T3, something called reverse T3. And that's an inactive compound, but it's actually part of the metabolism. And reverse T3 can be converted back and forth. And this conversion process takes place through things called the deiodinized enzymes. They're actually selenium dependent. Their little abbreviations for them are D1, D2, and D3. The most predominant deiodinized enzyme is called the Di2, and that is the main precursor to convert T4 to T3. So it's a big, it's a lot of metabolism goes on, to get to that conversion, okay? And the T3 is the one that actually gets into the cell, and that gives all the cells the metabolic rate. So when I'm actually looking at patients and I'm looking at their pathology, number one, I want to look at their T4 and go, okay, can your thyroid produce thyroid hormones? And we want to make sure that T4 is at a really good, adequate level, maybe around about 15 or above. If someone's taking thyroxine because their thyroid, due to an inability of their thyroid to make thyroid hormones in hyperthyroidism, that again is just inactive T4. It's not active in the body. It needs to be converted. So making sure that their T4, again, if they're on thyroxine, is at a good amount. The next step, okay, yes, you're absorbing your thyroxine or your thyroid's producing adequate T4, is I look at the T3 and then I look at the conversion and make sure that you're converting T4 to T3, because that is a really big part of thyroid metabolism that does not happen well in many, many thyroid patients. Is, yep, their TSH looks fine, their T4 looks fine, but if we actually look at their T3 and do a bit of a ratio, the T3 is not great. So looking at their gland's ability to make thyroid hormones, I'm looking at that conversion process, and then we need to make sure that that T3 can actually get into the cell. So cellular uptake, and that there's a lot of issues that can happen in that process as well.
I think what you're really underpinning is that there are lots of different chemical reactions that are happening at different points in the body, and it can be intercepted or impacted at any point, which is why your thyroid is so sensitive.
Yes, and just looking at a TSH or even just a TSH and T4 in pathology is just it's just not telling us anything. It's definitely, I want to look at the TSH. I definitely want to look at the T4, but it's putting what I coined the thyroid puzzle together for each patient. I coin it as a thyroid puzzle, and it's looking at everything. It's not just looking at pathology. It's looking at your diet, your lifestyle, your medications, your history, your hormones, everything.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about what can impact your thyroid? So diet, stress, toxins, nutrient status. You spoke a little bit about the minerals there, so your zinc, your selenium, and your iodine, and of course that's going to impact your thyroid, the ability of your thyroid to make thyroid hormones. as well as your ability to activate them and use them as well.
Yeah, well, I think we start, let's just look at the number one cause of thyroid conditions in the body. So the number one cause of hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism in the body, and we haven't actually got to, I guess, what those conditions are yet, but is autoimmunity. So when someone has antibodies, and that's the next sort of step in, I guess, testing, is looking at all the antibodies, because the number one driver that I'm looking for if you're presenting with hypo or hyper is, do you have antibodies? So autoimmunity is the number one cause. And it's like, well, what's tripping that cause on? And then, things such as low nutrients in the diet. We need iodine. You cannot make thyroid hormones without iodine. But just a heads up, it just means any of the nutrients or the things I'm talking about here, particularly nutrients, need to be tested and making sure that you actually need that. We don't just want to throw them in just because I'm talking about them. They definitely need to be tested. So iodine, tyrosine. So iodine combines with tyrosine in the first step of making both T4 and T3. Tyrosine comes from good protein foods, our eggs, our meat, amino acids, because tyrosine's an amino acid. Iron is involved in all steps of those thyroid hormone production steps that I talked about. So we need iron, good levels of ferritin in the body to make thyroid hormones, to convert to T3 and to get them into the cell. So iron has a very, very interesting relationship with the thyroid. We've talked about tyrosine, so good adequate levels of protein as well. They would be probably my top nutrients needed for thyroid hormone production. Other things, we know that stress, it's a really sensitive little gland. Like I said before, it's highly vascular. So we have a lot of blood vessels running into the gland. It's right near our lymph nodes. So, even a history of tonsillitis, so many patients that have hypothyroidism later in life have had recurrent tonsillitis. And if we think about that anatomical position of where the thyroid sits, and upper respiratory tract infections, including tonsils. I mean, it's a lymphocytic sort of problem, the tonsils, the lymph glands get very clogged. So any infection or virus, we can find, or they have found in research, actual viruses that get into the thyroid cells and sit there, and they can be what we call reactivation viral syndrome, and when you get sick and run down. So viruses, infections, nutritional deficiencies, there is a very strong relationship between the adrenal glands, which are the batteries of the thyroid. So chronic ongoing stress, high cortisol will definitely impact the thyroid gland as well. And any sort of toxicity. So, our heavy metals, our pesticides, any sort of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Maybe if we can talk about I think you spoke about it before, Sarah, women. So why are women, women are up to 10 times more likely to develop a thyroid condition than men. The first reason I would say is because of our busyness. Generally, in general here, we're the multitaskers. We often run businesses, look after children. We're thinking about dinner, doing the washing. We are great at multitasking, but we generally do a lot. We're busy, very busy, and that stress and cortisol, and that stress and cortisol affects our hormones, and there is that beautiful hormone connection with the thyroid hormones. Number two, women put a plethora of toxic endocrine chemicals on their body every day. I mean, if you think about my partner, he gets up, and he has done, even when we had 3 little children, has his breakfast, makes his lunch, and he's out the door. And he probably just thinks about work, whereas I've feeding all the kids, barely get time to sit on the toilet, running so many things. Generalize here, but it's, and then he walks out the door with not one toxic product on his body. I might wash my hair, put some body lotion on, put some makeup on, put some deodorant. So that's the second one, the toxic chemicals that we're exposed to as women more than men is another reason. And the third reason, which I'm sure we're going to jump into, is our hormonal fluctuations throughout our lifetime, from puberty, from our reproductive cycle, from pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, menopause. Those huge hormonal fluctuations throughout a lifetime just wreak havoc on the thyroid. And any time those fluctuations can disrupt thyroid function, cause a thyroid function, cause thyroid dysfunction, or the low thyroid or high thyroid or thyroid dysfunction can actually disrupt those life cycle events, hormonal life cycle events as well. So hormone stages can affect it, but definitely those toxins and heavy metals can affect it. Gut health, we haven't even spoken about the gut health. There is a huge direct correlation between thyroid health. I'm just writing a presentation for the Anti-Symposium at the moment, looking at the gut microbiome, jumping right into the nitty-gritties of gut microbiome and species and how that can affect our immune system functioning, cause autoimmunity, the absorption of our nutrients. So dysbiosis, intestinal permeability really can affect that. And also inflammation. I've talked about viruses and infections, but inflammation in the body is a really hallmark symptom of all our sort of thyroid autoimmune conditions as well.
Type of stressor in the environment, whether that be nutrient deficiencies, mold toxicity, it could be a virus, it could be gut intestinal hyperpermeability causing inflammation, it could be your job causing high cortisol, basically puts pressure on the thyroid. And then it can go in two ways. You can go hyper, which is an overactive thyroid, so we're producing too much T3 and T4, or hypo, which is an umbrella term for a lot of different things. So you mentioned them before, and I really want to get down into autoimmunity. I really want to talk about hormones and the sex differences. Talk, what is hypo and what is hyperthyroidism first? And what are the hallmark symptoms of each?
Sure. And symptoms do overlap, so it can be tricky. And always, in all of these things, we've always got some, definitely some hallmark symptoms, but I'm very big on clinical presentation. Everyone is an individual. Everyone presents so differently. Yes, we can contribute a few sort of like main symptoms to these conditions, but I tell you what, they overlap a lot. And everyone can be individual because we can actually experience low or high thyroid hormones in the body differently. Okay, depending on our receptors. It's all about our thyroid hormone receptors. But hypothyroidism is our underactive or low thyroid hormone state where we see low T4 and T3. And if we think about that metabolism we talked about before, that's sending that message back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary to keep sending down more TSH. So the thyroid is detecting, gosh, there's so much low thyroid hormone going on here. There's not enough to going around. And then the TSH will rise and rise, and it's like whipping the gland to say, come on, produce more. But if we don't have enough iodine, if we don't have enough zinc, if we don't have enough iron, if we have stress going on, if we have autoimmunity, the thyroid gland, or it's just exhausted, which most of the time it is, we're going to end, it's just struggling. So we often see a high TSH, low thyroid hormones. So I think of hypothyroidism as everything slows down. My patients often say they're wading through mud. It's like physical and mental exhaustion. They've got a lot of fatigue, and it's not fatigue, it's not tiredness, it's actual exhaustion. Like they need naps. They're struggling. It's like just wading through a thick mud every day in their brain and in their muscles. So aching muscles, so fatigue overall, is a really hallmark symptom. We can see the digestion slow down, so there can be constipation, but not always. Some people with hypo have SIBO and they have loose stools or whatever. Dry skin, hair loss, but that hair loss I think happens in both sides, hypo and hyper. Cold intolerance is a really kind of common one for hypo, so that circulation kind of slows down. Weight gain is, look, it is a bit of a hallmark symptoms for hypo because you think everything slows down, so metabolism's slowing down in every cell, but not always too. I've got some very active, thin Hashimoto's hypo patients as well. So it's very, very individual. But if you think of hypo as sluggishness, everything just slow down because there's not enough thyroid hormones getting into every cell to regulate the metabolic rate of that cell. And on the other hand, we have hyperthyroidism where, like you said before, we have high thyroid hormones. So we see an influx of these thyroid hormones, T4 and T3 in the body, and that sends the message back to the pituitary of like, well, back off. There's too much thyroid hormone in here. So we'll often see high T4, T3, and we'll see a low TSH because of that feedback system going. There's too much going on here. Back off. So this one, we have more distinct symptoms because it's hypothyroidism is quite aggressive on the body. I kind of think that hypo is more chronic, hyper is more acute. So particularly the heart, we see a lot of heart palpitations, though we can see heart palpitations in hypo as well. And we can see anxiety, we can see insomnia, we can see fast digestion, like loose stools. We can see weight loss, but that's only in the very early stages. Then that kind of really slows down. There can be tremors, so I always get my patients to hold their hands out in front of them, and there can be a fine tremor. They get very breathless. Any exertion, even like washing the car or walking upstairs, can cause a breathlessness, and they just get really puffed out. So exercise, they lose their exercise tolerance as well. So we can see there's, hypo is just really sluggish and slowing down, fatigue, and hyper is speeding up as well. But fatigue is also a common symptom in hyper. These, you can imagine, I coin hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease as like you're running a marathon whilst you're standing still. So you can be in the middle, it's like physiologically with really high thyroid hormones, your body's in the middle of a 20K marathon. So your heart's beating fast, you're sweating, like every cell is sped up. So it's actually quite a dangerous one that we need to bring under control. Yeah. So it's that acute presentation.
Let's keep going with that. Let's keep talking about hyperthyroidism, and then we'll come back to hypo.
Sure.
You were on such a beautiful tangent just then. So the common drivers of the symptoms of hyperthyroidism, you mentioned one of them is Graves' disease. And I feel like this is a really misunderstood thing that we see a lot in women. Do you mind explaining what the drivers are, how it comes up from a symptom, like from symptoms specifically, and if we see hyperthyroidism that isn't driven by antibodies at all, if that is something that you can see?
Yeah, so Graves' disease is autoimmune hyperthyroidism. And yes, I do agree. It's something that I'm really passionate about supporting in my patients and identifying, because it's something that, like I said before, hyper and Graves is considered a medical emergency. Having those high thyroid hormones on your heart and having heart palpitations and a high heart rate and it causes like loss of bone as well. So it's quite disastrous in the body. So, and if it can't be brought under control medically, they're pretty much, well, let's remove it. And I do everything in my power to avoid thyroidectomy or radioactive iodine ablation in my patients. But the biggest, like I said before, the number one driver of hyperthyroidism is Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is autoimmune hyper. And this is where the immune system makes these very specific antibodies, and they're called TSI or TSH-stimulating immunoglobulin antibodies. And what they do is they actually attack the TSH receptor on every little follicular cell. So the thyroid gland is made up with hundreds and hundreds of tiny little follicular cells, and that's where all the thyroid hormones making is happening in there. And this particular antibody, very specific to Graves, attacks the TSH receptor, and it basically causes those little follicles to overmake thyroid hormones. It's like a machine. So it's like a little stimulus going on and on and on. So whenever I'm seeing hyperthyroidism, the number one thing I'm going to rule out is to test those antibodies, to test the TSI, because that is the specific antibody that causes Graves' disease. And then we'll be treating that hyperthyroidism as an autoimmune condition. Okay, so we're looking at that. Okay, you've got the Graves antibody, so now it's autoimmune. And then we need to look at, okay, well, what's triggered your autoimmune? And Graves and hyper patients have some really unique characteristics that differ from hypo-Hashis. And one of them is a big trigger is stress, more so than hypo-Hashis. So ongoing chronic stress and trauma, poor sleep. Poor sleep is the straw that breaks the camel's back for these patients. And I feel like there is a type. They're the patients that are just super busy. They're often quite anxious. They might be sort of like that ADHD type that are just go. And then all of a sudden their immune system this triggers that poor sleep and that excessive stress will be a trigger. But there also other triggers. Again, it could be poor gut health. It could be nutritional deficiencies. It could be too much iodine. It could be an infection, a virus. We saw lots of Graves and a thyroiditis type presentation when COVID started happening. COVID had a very, very unique effect on the thyroid gland in many ways, and one of them was causing autoimmune Graves' disease as well.
Your body's like, okay, we need energy, and the question is, what does this body need the energy for? Is it running away from a stressor? Do we have a viral infection? Yeah, there's always an underneath. So what you're saying is Graves' disease isn't a be-all, end-all. There is a reason why it's manifested in the body, and we need to find out what that is and go at the root and remove that, and then also treat it as an autoimmune disorder. So how does Graves' disease specifically, and hyperthyroidism as well, how will that impact fertility? How will that impact a woman's cycle? How will that impact her biomarkers that she'll usually see, like her cervical fluid, her length of her period, whether she gets a period, if her period is light or heavy? How would it impact? How would it show up?
Yeah, so we often see in our hyper Graves patients quite like short luteal phases. It seems to like shorten the cycle, and we see actually quite light periods. So that's kind of not always everyone, but conversely in hypothyroidism, we see actually a lengthening of the cycle and quite heavy periods, and there's sort of some reasons for that. But any sort of over or underproduction of thyroid hormones in the body will be affecting our estrogen and our progesterone. Thyroid hormones act directly on our ovarian follicles. It can affect that hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, so we can see menstrual issues, we can see fertility issues. So it's definitely an impact that goes on there.
And then let's get into hypothyroidism. So everyone listening, hypo is low functioning, hyper is high functioning. So we're talking about low function of your thyroid. So what are the main drivers that you see of an underactive thyroid function, so hypothyroidism?
Yeah, well, again, we're looking to rule out other antibodies so the number one driver of hypo is Hashimoto's. So that is autoimmune hypothyroidism. And there are some specific antibodies we're looking at, such as thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin antibodies that are the main sort of drivers there. But just before we go into that, it's really important to look at the whole autoimmune picture, because patients can have both Hashimoto's and Graves' disease at the same time, but they can't have hypo and hyper at the same time. So that means that quite often I'll see Graves patients with the TSI antibodies, with TPO antibodies who are quite high, and with thyroglobulin antibodies, and conversely, Hashimoto's patients can have the gamut of antibodies as well. And it really takes it looking at how those antibodies are presenting, because people can flip from Hashimoto's to Graves. Quite often I will see patients with Graves' disease triggered, and then when I look back at their history, they probably went into pregnancy, because pregnancy is a huge trigger for a thyroid condition, with high TPO antibodies, and something has triggered that, and then they've gone on to trip into Graves. So, but let's go back to that's probably a little bit confusing, but when we think about Hashimoto, so if someone's presenting with low thyroid hormones and a high TSH, I'm going to look at their antibodies. And the most distinguishing antibody for Hashimoto's is something called the thyroid peroxidase antibody. And that antibody actually, it's not the antibody. The antibody causes an immune infiltration and inflammation into the gland. So it's not the antibody that causes the destructive damage in hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's. It's actually the antibodies driving the immune cells and the inflammation to the gland, and that inflammation can actually cause the cells to die off, or apoptosis, and that's causes. So the more that someone has those TPO antibodies, or that inflammation, or that immune infiltration, is that that inflammation causes damage to the gland, and then that person has a hard time producing thyroid hormones. So I always like to look at an ultrasound too, particularly, across the board in the gamut of my thyroid patients. But a thyroid ultrasound can show us a lot of information about that thyroid parenchyma. I'm talking too fast. The parenchyma being the thyroid tissue. So an ultrasound can be another level of information to a practitioner to go, right, well, actually, you've got a bit of fibrosis there, or you can see how much damage that those TPO antibodies have done, or you've got thyroid nodules. So, your thyroid gland, we can see why it's struggling to produce thyroid hormones. Yeah. And in some cases, that person may actually need, thyroid medication. They may need that thyroid support as well as what we're doing as well. So I guess Hashimoto's, when we've got those TPO antibodies, it's, again, exactly the same triggers and drivers that can cause Graves. It's a poor diet, it's stress, it's infections, it's viruses, it's toxins, it's poor gut health, all of those things that can contribute. I guess at the top, when we're looking at, I like to explain it's autoimmune is like three overlapping circles. Now, at the top of the circle, we have genetics, and there's definitely some genetics that we know that predispose people to autoimmune conditions. And interestingly, the genetics involved in both Graves and Hashimoto's yes, there's some specifics there, but also they're inflammatory type genes, they're autoimmune type genes. So it's a combination of genes that, predispose you to a risk. Being a female ups that risk as well. So that's why females are more, because of all the things we talked about before. Then we combine those genetics with our 2 X chromosomes. Interestingly, just before we jump onto the next point, is that being a female with 2 X chromosomes, we have a lot more immune cells. We have more macrophages. We have more white cells in general because of our 2 X chromosomes. During embryonic development, a lot more white cells are being made on those X chromosomes, different to a male. And that is for survival of the race. It's to ensure that we have a more robust immune system, but we also have more B lymphocytes. And B lymphocytes make our antibodies, our actual antibodies that cause Graves. So yeah, we've got that as females as well, plus our hormones. Then we put all those other things in the other circle, such as toxins, gut, stress, infections, viruses. So there's that, it's such a combined thing that the immune system makes those antibodies that causes immune infiltration and inflammation to cause either hypo or hyper.
Going on from that, so I just want to backlog as well and just make sure everyone listening understands. So Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition that underpins hypothyroidism, and so it disintegrates thyroid tissue in such a way that it stops us from producing an optimal amount of T3 and T4 and being able to use those molecules in the blood system. As opposed to hyperthyroidism, which is your Graves' disease, we have an autoimmune condition which impacts our output of T3 and T4, and we produce too much of it, and then we start to see a lower amount of TSH. Just to follow up and just to kind of summarize that so everyone listening is like, okay, I fully understand those 2 branches. So coming back to hypothyroidism, just how can that affect the menstrual cycle, ovulation, fertility, and what can we see co-occur with that as well? Because I know that when estrogen becomes a little bit too dominant, I'm wondering if you're seeing this in your clinic as well with women. If we see estrogen dominance, say in a case of endometriosis and in cases like adenomyosis as well, we can have too much thyroid binding globulin. So we might have normal amounts of a perfectly healthy thyroid, but we have too much of this globulin that's basically trapping it and stopping it from attaching to receptor sites. So do you mind telling us a little bit more about that and how hypothyroidism can show up in the menstrual cycle and for women's hormones as well?
Yeah, sure. So as I said before, thyroid hormones influence the production and activity of like estrogen and progesterone. And in the case of like hypothyroidism, low thyroid hormones can actually deprive or disrupt that hypothalamic pituitary axis because those thyroid hormones really help to regulate that menstrual cycle. So in hypothyroidism will deprive those ovarian follicles, the thyroid hormones they need for things like ovulation and to make progesterone. So we can often see low progesterone there, which affects ovulation. We often see menorrhagia or quite heavy periods with hypo and Hashimoto's. There's a couple of reasons there, generally to the one of like the ovarian follicles are being deprived of thyroid hormones. Also, low thyroid hormones can affect coagulation factors, so that can actually sort of like cause more of a heavy flow. And as you said there too, it disrupts that estrogen metabolism. So if we're seeing low progesterone, we're often seeing high estrogen. So let's talk about TBG or thyroid binding globulin. So when the thyroid hormones are released out into the bloodstream, they are bound to binding proteins. So albumin, transthyretin, but the main ones, 70% are bound to thyroid binding globulin. And they travel around in the body to target cells or the gut or the liver to be converted, bound to TBG or thyroid binding globulin. And actually when we're measuring the thyroid hormones, some of them could be bound. And when they're bound, they're not actually able to conversion until they hit a target cell. Now, when we're seeing high estrogen, which is very common, also the other reason is in hypothyroidism, liver metabolism slows down. Yeah. And so we see poor metabolism of estrogen as well. And then throw in an MTHFR or something like that. We've got a lot of issues. So estrogen gets higher in hypo and Hashies, and that same molecule TBG that binds T4 also binds estrogen. So when estrogen is in high amounts in the conditions that you talked about, more thyroid binding globulin will be produced, and that will try and bind onto the estrogen to get it out of the body. limit it, but then it's also going to bind onto more T4. So when I see we talked before about poor conversion of T4 to T3. So when I'm seeing really poor conversion, that ratio of 3:1 T4 to T3, I will look at their estrogen. I might test their estrogen. I might look at their symptoms and signs and symptoms, their periods, because quite a lot of their bound T4 is bound because of extra TBG in the body, and it can't be converted. Now, so does that make sense? So high estrogen in hypothyroidism, more binding thyroid binding globulin binds onto their T4, less is available for conversion. Even though it looks good on paper, even though it looks good on pathology, it's bound and it can't be converted. Now, throw in constipation, which is very common, again, in hypothyroidism. Constipation, our bowel clearance actually deconjugates estrogen as well, and it's another sort of outlet of high estrogen in the body. So if you're seeing someone with poor estrogen metabolism, hypothyroidism, heavy periods, and they're constipated, it's like a double whammy. And when we actually support the liver metabolism of estrogen, when we actually get the bowel moving, then their conversion, I get better conversion. So yes, it's a big thing there, and that's a really common problem I see in my hypothyroid patients. The other thing about heavy bleeding in the menorrhagia is that we talked a little bit before about iron, right? And there is that very symbiotic relationship between iron. Low iron throughout a woman's life is a real trigger factor for hypothyroidism. So this actual iron is needed for thyroid hormone production, metabolism, and conversion. It's the TPO enzyme, which is one of the sort of metabolizing steps in thyroid hormone production, is heme dependent. So if we don't have enough iron, we can be slower at producing thyroid hormones in that gland. And also we think about we need good iron for healthy periods, and heavy menstruation. We're going to lose our iron. In hypothyroidism, that digestion can slow. We can also see low hydrochloric acid as a common feature in hypo and Hashis. So we're not absorbing iron as well from our diet, right? So there's a lot of reasons why or how hypo can actually contribute to that heavy periods and even a longer cycle and high estrogen.
Yeah, it's this really intense negative feedback loop with estrogen and hypothyroidism. It's like hyperthyroidism will slow down your constipation or will cause constipation, which means we reabsorb more of that 16 type metabolite of that estrogen, which is quite naughty and very, very estrogenic in the body, which takes more iron out of the blood system and puts it on endometrium. And we already have that coagulation factor going on, which is very, very interesting to find out today. And so we have heavier periods, so we're losing more iron, and it just gets worse and worse.
It gets worse and worse. And thyroid is a really contributing factor there, low thyroid hormones or, poor conversion of T4 to T3, or just not being able to get T3 into the cells, into the endometrium cells, to produce good progesterone and estrogen metabolism. So it's absolutely, it's never one thing, right? There's always this, it's the investigator hat we have to put on as practitioners to, okay, what is going on here?
Yeah. And so you spoke about this previously before, and I'd like to go into a little bit deeper, those life stages. So puberty, pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause. How can this impact thyroid health? What do you see, and what did you experience as well? Because you've had 3 children, so you've seen the impact of how it can impact your thyroid specifically as well.
Well, we know women, go through very dramatic, hormonal life stages, or hormonal, stages throughout their life cycle from puberty. So girls going into puberty with, poor thyroid function can have a worsening time. At that stage, we can see different sort of things happen. We can see perhaps girls that have early breast development, early periods. We're seeing girls actually get periods earlier and earlier, 8-9 years of age. And I just don't think that the thyroid is even considered in these cases for these girls. So there's a lot of research out there of the importance of thyroid function. And then just like we've talked about, to have that really good period, if you're having period issues, light periods, heavy periods, painful periods, the thyroid definitely, because how it influences that estrogen progesterone, we definitely need to have that thyroid support or rule out a thyroid condition during that reproductive cycle. Pregnancy is a stress test for the thyroid, particularly in that first trimester. There is a lot of stuff going on in the first, and a lot of women, I think, go into pregnancy without knowing if they've got Hashimoto's because they don't routinely test antibodies. And a lot of women go in with a subclinical, and we haven't really talked about subclinical presentations, but that's kind of like the pre-hyper. Many women, and because only TSH is tested and it's in range, but anything sort of above a 2.5 is a subclinical, up to actually 10, would you believe, in the medical algorithm, which is crazy. But if you're when you go into pregnancy, particularly that first trimester, your developing fetus, all that cell replication, has no thyroid until about 15 to 18 weeks gestation. So around about sort of the end of trimester 1. So that mum's thyroid has to have enough thyroid hormones to support her own maternal body and that developing fetus. So if you're going in with not enough thyroid hormones, it can be actually detrimental to that developing fetus, can cause miscarriages. It can have really devastating impacts on the development of that child as well, and also the mum. So quite often we see thyroid conditions developing and they need that thyroxine, particularly during that first trimester, because we need more thyroid hormones for both mum and that baby. Then it sort of lessens around second and third trimester, but it's still important. And then in lactation as well, you can't have healthy breast milk without adequate thyroid hormone supply. So it's thyroid hormones and prolactin are very much linked as well. And then we go to the next stages, which are perimenopause and menopause. And if you have a family history, you have some of those risk factors, and if you haven't developed a thyroid condition after all of this, I tell you what, I see so many women with perimenopause ending up with a thyroid condition. Or it's women going into perimenopause with really poor adrenal function and thyroid function, end up having a worse time. The fluctuation of hormones is really dramatic. And, we've already talked about estrogen, but we've got estrogen swinging all over the place. We've got low progesterone. That's going to wreak havoc on your thyroid. You really need adequate thyroid hormones in that stage. And then this kind of the next thing here, which is just crazy, is that in menopause, we see actually our estrogen. So our predominant estrogen throughout our reproductive years is that estradiol, that E2, right? In postmenopausal women, it actually changes to E1. And E1 is actually quite inflammatory, and it can actually, so we lose the protectiveness of estradiol, and we can be more predisposed to autoimmune conditions. And I've had many women around about sort of late 60s, early 70s in my clinic with Graves' disease. They've never had a thyroid condition and all of a sudden in their life, and all of a sudden they've got Graves. Look, it's not the only factor. There's also stress and poor gut health and the other things going on, but it's, there is a bit of a case for that. Now we've got E1 in dominance, and that is not immune modulating at all. It's actually quite immunostimulatory. Yeah. So we've got, and that's very much all in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it than that, but yeah.
Sure. And I just want to go back and talk about that immuno connection between estradiol and estrione, and our mast cells specifically. We see it with women of estrogen dominance. We have too many mast cells. We have too many histamines, so we can get migraines and things like that. But how can excess estrogen, or the wrong type of estrogen, or this inflammatory type, this E1 type of estrogen, impact our autoimmunity and therefore impact our thyroid? Is that what you're seeing in women with perimenopause specifically? We're seeing that switch over, and then all of a sudden we have this autoimmune inflammatory condition that's attacking our thyroid.
Yeah, it is. And I think that, there's a lot to say. Yes, definitely estrogen. It's such a fine balance, as you know, with estrogen. And, estrogen needs to be metabolized properly, and it needs to be this beautiful balance between the three. Interestingly, too, what we didn't talk about is in pregnancy, we see an amelioration of a lot of our autoimmune conditions. So estrogen in pregnancy is immunosuppressive, but in perimenopause, it becomes immunostimulatory. The placenta actually makes high amounts of E3. So we've talked about E2 and E1, but E3. And that actually is the contributing factor of immune modulation and in pregnancy. And women, if they get through those first few weeks and those high antibodies does not actually lead to miscarriage, because it can, then we see the immune system kicking in E2 becoming more predominant from the placenta. and women report the lowest antibodies they've ever had in their pregnancy. They'll go, oh my God, look at my, on their blood tests, they'll go, oh, look at my TPO antibodies, they're so low. I'm saying, yes, but that is a risk factor for postpartum thyroiditis. And we can actually immune modulate quite nicely in pregnancy as well to prevent that. But then, yes, and then we move on to that next stage and it shifts again. So it's actually, it's a beautiful flow and change and a lovely homeostatic, but yes, postmenopausal women have a lot of challenges, with their losing their estrogen, shifting to a different form. So they really need to look after themselves. Entering into I think across the board, we all need to look after our health, but it becomes super important in perimenopause.
Just focusing in a little bit more on perimenopause, just a curious question. Are you seeing a larger presentation of hyper or hypothyroidism? What are you seeing mostly?
More hypo, I would say. I would say what I see predominantly is that women entering into peri just busy, they're sort of in their 40s. It's meant to be the prime of their life and they're having a good time and the kids are getting a little bit older, but also too, they might be dealing with teenagers. They might be dealing with parents that are suddenly going into, needing more help and their health declining. So there's a lot of probably stress. And then they're going into this time where it's such a huge recalibration of so many things, our hormones, our brain, our cardiovascular, our immune systems. If there is not enough thyroid hormones and they're really, really stressed out, that they're the women I see with hypothyroidism either developing at that time or it just gets worse, or we've got to really support that thyroid to help them get through that transition, which can be, up to 10 years really.
Yeah. Let's step back and just talk a little bit more about hyper and hypo and just what you would recommend for each. So let's just focus on hypothyroidism. So what are some foods to eat versus avoid? What are some misunderstandings that we have as well? Because I've read a blog post that you have about goitrogens and the misunderstandings we have around cruciferous vegetables and their benefit versus their positive aspects as well. So let's just talk a little bit about that. How would you go about hypothyroidism?
Yeah, so we want to really focus on what I call like a very nutrient dense diet. So we've talked about a lot of the nutrients. So there's a lot of like little cofactors that are needed in thyroid hormone production. So I call the thyroid quite a nutrient dense or nutrient expensive little gland. It needs adequate amounts of these types of nutrients. So I really focus on a nutrient dense diet, so focusing on really good quality organic grass-fed meat, proteins or seafood or chicken, just whatever it is. It just needs to be good protein because that supplies the amino acids to make thyroid hormones, and for the tyrosine it provides the B12, the iron, the zinc. That's really important as well. Mediterranean type diet is a great sort of one to follow as well. A little bit of red meat to support everything going on, some really good fish and fatty fish, nuts and seeds, low sort of grain, absolutely gluten-free and dairy-free, because these conditions are an inflammatory process. So there has been research around gluten, molecular mimicry, so being the same sort of molecular structure as antibodies. So we kind of remove gluten and dairy, which can be inflammatory in the body. And just really focus on nutrient dense. I do say plant-based as well, because supporting the gut, supporting the fiber. So having your plate 3/4 full of beautiful, fennel, brightly colored veggies for the fiber and the antioxidants, good protein, good fats. And plant carbs, like to focus on plant carbs. In hypothyroidism, we're often low in T3. T3 is carbohydrate dependent. So we need to have, I think women for hormones, for thyroid hormone production, they do need carbohydrates. And I love to focus on the plant carbs, the sweet potato, the pumpkin, the carrots, that sort of things. Yes, and there is that sort of old, sort of outdated theory that, so our brassica vegetables, things like kale, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, they do contain some goitrogens. And a goitrogenic food is something that contains or has the ability to block the uptake of iodine. So in hypo-Hashis, we need iodine, though we do have to be careful with iodine in Hashimoto's because it can stimulate more antibodies. So it's a delicate balance. But those beautiful brassica vegetables actually have great liver properties that we need to metabolize estrogen and support our liver function. They're rich in antioxidants. And we just lightly steam and cook them. And that cuts down some of those goitrogens. And you have to eat a lot of it. So if someone was having like a raw kale soy smoothie, soy is another known goitrogen. Eat processed soy, pro-soy isolate, but not natto soy. So if someone was having a raw kale soy smoothie every day, I'd say, well, okay, let's cut that out. So lots of bucket loads of raw kale, sure, could be, detrimental, but I think a varied diet, but lots of really lots of oysters for the zinc, and pate is great, organic liver, all those organ meats are fantastic.
Yeah, great. I love how you touched on goitrogens just then, and that's what I've always told people as well. Yes, you can eat cruciferous vegetables, and your brassicas are really, really amazing, especially in cases of hypothyroidism and estrogen dominance, because we need the in there to be able to help us digest that excess estrogen. That's going to help us too. Just cook them.
And goitrogens come from other places as well. I think the environmental goitrogens that we're exposed to from new cars, from phthalates, from phytates, from, anything in your environment. So new cars, new couches, new rugs, carpets, all of those things contain alpha-gassing and chemicals, flame retardants, and they all have a goitrogenic activity. Your thyroid gland can suck up those chemicals like no tomorrow. Chlorine, like filtering your water, is so important. Minimizing your toxic exposure, because actually water, scheme water from the tap, has usually chlorine and fluoride and bromide, and they actually sit on the same what's it called?
The elemental table. They sit on the same.
Yes, the elemental table. They sit on the same thing, and they're actually larger molecular weight than iodine. So, like swimming in swimming pools, I have had so many swim instructors with Hashimoto's. And even breast cancer, actually, because they're drinking that water. It's very hard to be in a pool all day without getting in. It's getting into their skin, and they're inhaling the chlorine as well. And I've seen so many swim or young girls that do swim training. A lot of them have ended up with a thyroid condition because of that chlorine exposure from a pool. And blocking the uptake of iodine. So filter your water, eat your brassica veggies, cook them, steam them, but I think environmental chemicals, you need to be more aware of those than brassicas 100%.
Yeah. And can we talk a little bit about iodine as well? Because there is a lot of misunderstanding about iodine and how it impacts your thyroid. I guess generally people understand iodine equals more thyroid hormone, but not necessarily all the time, especially with a few of the factors you were just talking about. So under the umbrella of like hypo versus hyperthyroidism, how does iodine fit in with each of these constitutions?
Well, I like to call iodine the Goldilocks nutrient, because it's like we need it to make thyroid hormones, but too much can be detrimental. And look, there's a lot of differential views out there on iodine, but through my research and my practice with my thyroid patients, I always test. So if someone's coming to me with Hashimoto's, I'm going to, or hypothyroidism, I'm going to test their iodine and make sure that, yes, they need it, and making sure they're getting it through their diet. Dietary and even herbal sources of iodine seem to be assimilated better in the body than supplements, synthetic iodine supplements. But if someone has hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, and they've got high TPO antibodies, excess iodine can aggravate that and cause higher antibodies and a higher TSH. So TSH, when you start taking iodine, you will raise your TSH and raise your TPOs. So it needs to be done under guidance, because yes, those people need it because they've got low thyroid hormones. But what we need to do first is to decrease the inflammation, decrease the oxidative stress, getting certain nutrients that help to assimilate iodine better. So iron and selenium really help to assimilate that iodine better in the body, decrease those antibodies a bit, and then we get it in slowly. So I'm talking microgram doses here, very slowly. On the other side of the coin, when we think about hypothyroidism and even Graves', the body is, or the thyroid is overproducing thyroid hormones. So putting iodine in at that stage is just adding fuel to a fire. Well, they're already grasping and getting as much iodine as they can, like from the bloodstream. They cross over into the gland to make those thyroid hormones. So it's pumping through. And we do find post-Graves', post-hyper remission, patients are low on iodine because that makes sense. But at the time, I go through, make sure, I can't tell you how many times someone has presented with hyper and Graves', and they're on some very common skin, hair, nails formula that is really too high dose iodine.
I'm going to drop JS Health. You guys put way too much iodine in your supplements.
Yes,
anyone's taking JS Health at the moment, please.
It's definitely a common one as well.
God,
and even oyster, at the moment, the oyster capsules have powders everyone's taking. It's got iodine, which look is great for a person that doesn't have hyper or Graves. That little TSI antibody that is specifically causing hypothyroidism in Graves is super sensitive to iodine. Yeah. So any little bit of iodine that comes in, you are flaring your Graves. So we restrict, again, to get those antibodies down, get that presentation better. Then post, everything settled down, I test then, and we go, right, let's get some dietary sources in, see how you respond. Perhaps let's get in a microdome, 100 micrograms in and see how you respond. But it's slow and steady. And some people, I think, just have genetics that they just do not utilize iodine. Iodine's a real tricky one. I think it's got a lot to do with inflammation in the body, low selenium, low iron, your genetic makeup as well. It's not just cut and dry of like, let's get onto some iodine. It's not as easy as that. I wish it was.
Same here. And it's almost anti-establishment, really, because I feel like we have almost medicalized nutrition in a way. Because if someone got a blood test back and it showed up with low iodine, the immediate thing that most practitioners will do is we need to get you eating more iodine-rich foods. But instead, you're saying, hang on a second, let's look at your TPO antibodies. Let's look at the output of T3 here. Let's actually make sure we're not adding fuel to this fire. So it's a really complicated answer with iodine. With the thyroid, it's not going to be easy.
It is. Yes.
Just going a little bit into thyroxine. What is your opinion on thyroxine? How do you work this into your clinic? Is it a be-all and end-all? There's a lot of misinformation about thyroxine as a medication and how it fits into allopathic and alternative versions of how we can care for thyroid patients as well.
Yeah, I feel, look, it is, I think for some people it's necessary. Look, it's something that came out years and years ago. And it was a drug that was actually really pushed onto all. It was almost like, some of those drugs that the reps went round and we're using this. No, we're not using that. We're using this. And that's the way it's been used for many, many years. To be 100% honest with you, I feel like when we think about the thyroid physiology, the thyroid makes predominantly T4 and a little bit of T3. And that's the way I think we need to sort of combine it. Because many people just taking that thyroxine, they don't absorb it well, and they definitely don't convert it. There are some patients that can have polymorphisms against the deiodinized enzymes. So they do not convert, no matter how much thyroxine they take, they will not convert T4, T3. They're terrible converters. And they're the patients, we can't actually test that. There's a UK test, saliva test, currently the UK and the US, I think, but it's not here. But I will come to my conclusion about those patients when I've tried everything to support their cortisol, to make sure their estrogen's good, to make sure their liver, their gut, their inflammation's down. Cortisol is a big reason for poor conversion, T4 to T3, high cortisol stress. But if I've worked on everything and they're doing tickety-boo and they still are poor converters, I'm getting them onto T3. And I do believe at the end of the day, natural desiccated thyroid with a little bit of T4 and T3 is heaps better than T4, and or T4 with some active T3. For those patients that have, thyroid removal, or they have polymorphisms against the deiodinized enzymes, or they just can't produce thyroid hormones and they need medication. So there are some people that have to have thyroid hormone replacement because their gland is atrophic, or they've removed their gland, or they've had radioactive iodine ablation. But I don't think thyroxine, if I was one of those patients, I would be definitely putting T3 in my prescription, whether it's natural desiccated thyroid or T4 and T3. And that's the natural physiology of the gland. I think T3, and look, we're making inroads. It's happening. It's happening in different countries. I see patients only on T3. I see patients on natural desiccated. I see patients on some T4, some T3. It is a bit of a personal decision, and it's coming up and finding that right thing for you if you really need it. But yes, I think thyroxine is overprescribed, particularly for subclinicals, for people that really let's just do a bit of work on your body and decrease those risk factors. You may not need it in the end, because once you are diagnosed and put on it, it's impossible. It's like almost impossible to come off. Yeah. Unfortunately, because the thyroid goes on holiday. It's like it doesn't have to work to produce that predominant hormone anymore. It's going to pack its bag and go, I'm off to Egypt. Not probably in Egypt. Where are we going? I'm going to Italy.
I'm off. I'm not being used, so I'm not going to make this hormone anymore.
No.
Yeah. And I have heard a bit of misinformation out there as well. I have heard of a few people peddling the idea that the thyroid can grow back. Can you please say something about this? What's your opinion?
Now, yes, I have seen, yes. But I mean, if you've had it removed and there's some little bit of tissue, yes, I believe it can. It can, but it takes a long time. I've had patients that have been born or thought they've never had a thyroid gland, and they've had ultrasounds when they were little, and then they've had ultrasounds later on and there's tissue growing. It can actually regenerate. Yes.
I was not expecting that answer. I was fully expecting for you to say, no, the only organ that grows back in the body is your liver. Wow, that's incredible.
I've seen it grow. I mean, that's why when say if you've had thyroid cancer and they do a total thyroidectomy, then they radioactive iodine ablate, because they're going to try and kill off, because sometimes a little bit of tissue is missed. And they try to kill off every little bit of tissue because they don't want that gland growing back and you getting cancer in the gland. But people can regrow. I've seen it even on an ultrasound, so it is possible. But whether they're going to grow a full, healthy, juicy thyroid, fully functioning in their lifetime is another story, right? But yes, tissue can regrow.
Wow, thank you so much, Tara. And just to end this, for someone who's newly diagnosed with any form of thyroid disorder and they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, what's the best place to start and where's the best place to go? Is this to you?
Yes, or one of the other wonderful practitioners that I do mentor, that do my courses. There's some really good thyroid practitioners out there. But look, if you're looking for someone, make sure that they're thyroid. I think it's a bit of a niche, as we all are in these niches these days. It's complex, as you've probably listening to this, you're going, well, there's so much to it. There is. It's complex, and I'm constantly finding, it's an evolving system of medicine, I think, as well, which is exciting. But look for that person. I do think, find someone to help your journey, because I see so many patients that have struggled for so many years on their own, and then they come to me and we're just tweaking a couple of things, and it's like, oh, that's it. There's always that little bit of thing where you get that fresh eyes that has that investigative microscope on it. But find that person through their website, have the conversation and ask about their experience in treating thyroid health. And I do have, even on my website, practitioners that have done my training, done my 2 thyroid courses, and they're accredited. So you might be able to find someone in your area. Or yes, I do online as well. And I have another naturopath that works for me too.
Wonderful. I'll make sure all of that is in the bio underneath. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
How amazing is Tara? She is such a truth bomb about our amazing thyroid. I just wanted to close up this podcast with some more information, because I forgot to ask her questions about hormonal birth control and its impact on the thyroid. And I'm kind of knocking at myself. Oh gosh, I wish I asked her more questions, but I've done some research and I'm going to relay this information back to you as well, because a lot of women, I think, are listening to this podcast and are on the journey of trying to heal their bodies after hormonal birth control and trying to rebalance. And I think a lot of women who have listened to this podcast as well have listened to particularly the autoimmune parts and possibly the hypothyroidism, so that underfunctioning thyroid symptomology. So hair falling out, feeling like you're going through mud, caffeine doesn't do anything. You could, sleep for 12 hours and you don't feel rested. You feel very fatigued and cold all the time. This is the experience that a lot of women have after they start to defrag their bodies after hormonal birth control. So I wanted to talk about some of the staggering and the most well-documented ways that hormonal birth control can impact the thyroid. So let's start with how it impacts your thyroid binding globulin. The estrogen component of hormonal birth control, also known as estradiol, in birth control pills increases the levels of thyroxine binding globulin. Tara spoke about this a lot on the podcast. So if you're not sure what this is, perhaps go back and listen to the podcast again. Basically, this is the main protein that binds thyroid hormones in the blood. This means that more of your thyroid hormone is tied up, so to speak, and it's less available in the free active form. So it's in jail and it can't actually access the membrane and the cellular receptor sites to tell the cell, hey, there's glucose around, there's fat around, let's utilize this energy, let's fuel metabolic processes and use protein to do work in the body. But if we have less of this, it means that our thyroid will appear like it's underperforming, even though we have normal amounts of T3 and T4. We might have just too much TBG, which is something that happens with estrogen dominance as well. If we have too much estrogen around, it basically tells our body to make more and more and more thyroid binding globulin, which means we can have hypothyroidism co-occurring with the symptomology of estrogen dominance as well. Because of this reason, it's been documented that women already on thyroxine, so the thyroid medication, often need higher doses when they start the pill. And this is because the body compensates with the extra TBG by requiring more thyroid hormone to keep it enough in its free active form. And so that's really interesting. Another thing we need to keep in mind, and this is very well documented, very well understood in the literature, is that hormonal birth control really alters our ability to absorb nutrients. And funnily enough, these are the nutrients we really need to have a well-functioning thyroid. So zinc, selenium, magnesium, iron, and iodine are all decreased in their absorption in the gut when we are taking specifically combined oral contraceptives, so the estradiol and the progestin together in a pill. The other really important part of hormonal birth control and how it can have this interplay with our thyroid is that it is inflammatory. By nature, all hormonal birth controls will have an inflammatory reaction in the body. More likely, your combined oral contraceptives will have more of an inflammatory action in the body. So estradiol and progestin, also known as the pill, whereas the mini pill is just progestin on its own. But generally, we see that oral contraceptives have more of an inflammatory reaction in the body. And at its crux, inflammation is a tool used by our immune system. So if we are taking something, or if we're on hormonal birth control for a prolonged period of time, we are exposed to higher levels of inflammation for a long period of time, which increases our risk of autoimmunity. And the largest cause of hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's. So our immune system is attacking our thyroid in a way that it degrades the tissue, and our output of T3 and T4 decreases. Conversely, we can also see an increase in things like Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune reaction on our thyroid, which increases its output and runs the thyroid down slowly, and it's very aggressive on the body, whereas hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's is a bit slower, as Tara was explaining there as well. So yes, hormonal birth control does have a very, very succinct impact on our thyroid over the long term. I have a whole class on the thyroid and how it can impact your body. I have an entire class on the thyroid and how hormonal birth control can impact our thyroid in my course, Hormone Harmony. If you wanted to access that course and get $100 off, if you look in the bio of this, wherever you're looking, you will see it there, a link, and you will see a discount code to get $100 off that course. There is a whole lesson on that alongside 17 other lessons, quizzes, and there are other things associated with that course as well. And you get lifetime access. I think altogether it's 22 hours worth of content. So if you're coming off the pill and you're wanting a resource to learn everything about your body, reconnecting with your anatomy and physiology, that is there for you. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. I was so excited to have her on. I'm so happy to have her here on the pod. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment. It's free information that takes energy and time from clinicians and myself. So please make sure you're supporting this free resource and sending it to the other amazing women in your life. And I will see you on the next pod.